When night fell over the cobbled streets of medieval Europe, the cities did not sleep. Behind the heavy oak doors and stone walls, candles flickered against parchment and prayer books, but elsewhere, the glow came from lanterns hanging outside narrow doorways, where music, laughter, and whispers filled the dark. The medieval bordel, or brothel, was not simply a place of desire. It was an institution woven deeply into the social and economic fabric of the age, a paradoxical space where sin was both condemned and tolerated, where pleasure met poverty, and where moral law met the realities of survival. In the beginning, the church and state alike had little desire to acknowledge such places. Yet their existence was undeniable. Pilgrims, soldiers, travelers, merchants, all men moving through growing medieval cities, found themselves in need of warmth, company, and distraction. And so, what could not be eradicated was instead contained. As early as the 12th century, cities like Paris, Avignon, and London began to regulate their houses of entertainment through civic ordinances. These were not hidden dens of secrecy, they were, paradoxically, recognized by law. In Paris, the so-called Rue du Bordel, from which the modern word derives, was officially designated for such establishments. Brothel keepers paid taxes. Workers were subject to rules. The city even enforced curfews and dress codes, ensuring that the women could be identified and kept apart from the respectable citizens. The church, meanwhile, maintained an uneasy tolerance. Theologians argued that while such places were sinful, they prevented greater evils. Saint Augustine had written centuries earlier that removing such outlets from society would lead to chaos, a view echoed by later thinkers who saw regulation as the lesser sin. In this moral economy, the bordel was a kind of social safety valve, sinful, yes, but necessary for the stability of cities governed by human frailty. To walk through the district of the bordel was to step into a different rhythm of medieval life. By day, the narrow lanes were quiet, shadows stretching between stone walls. By night, the air filled with song, the scent of ale and incense mingling as lanterns swayed in the breeze. Within, the interiors were simple, wooden benches, a table for dice, a jug of wine. The women who worked there came from all corners of the realm, widows, servants, travelers, orphans, each carrying her own story, her own reason for being there. Some came seeking escape from poverty. Others were sold into service by circumstance or force. Yet within those walls, a strange kind of order reigned. Brothel keepers were required to register their houses, and the city appointed officials, sometimes even clerics, to inspect them. The paradox deepened. What was deemed sinful was also meticulously documented, recorded, and controlled. Medieval society's view of intimacy was not simply moral but structural. Every act, every encounter existed within a hierarchy, of gender, of wealth, of faith. The bordel, though marginal, reflected these hierarchies perfectly. It was a mirror of the broader world, its inequalities, its hypocrisies, and its quiet humanity. To the moralists of the age, these women embodied sin. To the city officials, they were a revenue source. To the theologians, a necessary evil. But to the people who lived within that world, to the women themselves, survival was not an abstraction. It was a daily negotiation between law and survival, shame and dignity, judgment and endurance. The regulated city. How the law shaped desire. By the 13th century, European cities had grown restless, alive with movement and trade. Markets swelled with merchants. Streets echoed with the sound of hooves and laughter. Cathedrals reached higher each year. And beneath that upward motion, quietly, the bordel evolved alongside the city itself, both thriving on proximity, both watched by the same authorities who claimed to keep them in order. Municipal records from places like Nuremberg, Paris, and London reveal a web of ordinances carefully designed to contain what could not be eradicated. These rules dictated where bordels could stand, how they could operate, and who could work within them. The location was often deliberate, near the river, close to the city gates, but away from the churches and marketplaces. It was a geography of control, a cartography of tolerance. In Nuremberg, for instance, the Frauenturm, the women's tower, served as both housing and workplace, a symbol of civic order cloaked in moral paradox. The city council issued licenses to brothel keepers, not to encourage their business, but to ensure that it could be taxed and monitored. In exchange for regulation came protection, or at least, the illusion of it. Women who worked within legal bordels were, in theory, under the watch of the city. They could not be harassed by soldiers or merchants in the streets. They were expected to stay within their designated quarters, and in return, the law recognized them as part of the civic economy. But that recognition came with limits. They could not marry without permission. They could not inherit property. Their clothes were marked, sometimes by a colored veil or ribbon, a visible reminder of their difference. And yet, in this strange compromise between morality and necessity, the medieval city revealed its most human contradiction. It punished what it relied upon. Behind each ordinance was an admission that human desire was not easily governed. Theologians debated the moral implications. Could one justify tolerance of vice for the preservation of virtue? Was it better to regulate what could not be extinguished, or to risk hypocrisy by pretending purity existed at all? Thomas Aquinas himself touched upon the idea, echoing Augustine before him. Remove the outlet, he said, and greater corruption will follow. To medieval logic, regulation was an act of moral containment, not approval, but acceptance of imperfection as part of divine design. This pragmatic morality shaped the lives of thousands. For many women, working in the bordel was not a fall from grace but a form of survival, a transaction in a world where choices were few and protection scarce. They existed within the system, yet always apart from it, their lives balancing on a line drawn by law and faith alike. And still, the bordel thrived. Not because it was celebrated, but because it was needed. It was where knights and merchants sought escape from the weight of expectation. Where confessions whispered in shadow clashed with sermons preached in daylight. It was, in essence, the hidden rhythm of the city, the unspoken heartbeat of its human contradictions. The brothel keeper, too, occupied a peculiar place in this hierarchy. Often a widow or woman of experience, she managed the establishment as both business and shield. She dealt with city officials, negotiated rents, enforced curfews, and ensured that disputes did not spill beyond the threshold. Some kept records, lists of visitors, accounts of expenses, even payments made to priests or guards. These fragments, preserved in dusty archives, reveal the intricate ties between legality and discretion. The city profited from its bordels, yet scorned them. Officials taxed their income, but would not dine with those who earned it. Priests accepted confessions from their patrons but refused burial for the women when their lives ended in silence. The bordel existed between worlds, visible yet untouchable, legal yet condemned, human yet judged by the inhumanity of its own necessity. As centuries turned, the system endured. Each law written to control it only affirmed its permanence. For in every era, from the dim alleys of Paris to the canals of Venice, the same truth lingered. Where there is desire, there is negotiation, and where there is negotiation, there is law. The bordel was not a defiance of civilization. It was a part of it. It mirrored the very soul of the medieval city, proud and sinful, devout and indulgent, endlessly aware of its own contradictions. The church and the shadow market of morality. If the medieval city built walls around its desires, then the church built sermons. From the pulpits of stone cathedrals, preachers thundered against temptation, warning of damnation and the fires of sin. Yet even as those sermons echoed through vaulted halls, the same cities housed bordels under official sanction, sometimes a short walk from the church doors. It was one of history's quiet contradictions, a dance between moral authority and pragmatic tolerance. The church did not create the bordel, but it learned to live alongside it. In theological terms, the argument was old. Augustine, centuries before, had written that removing vice entirely would be like tearing down the sewage of a city. It might seem virtuous, but soon the streets would overflow. His words echoed into the Middle Ages, reshaping the church's uneasy policy. Better to regulate than to deny. Still, preachers spoke fiercely of repentance. In confessionals, priests urged women of the trade to abandon their work. Some offered penance through pilgrimages or service to hospitals. And yet, many of those same institutions, monasteries, bishoprics, and abbeys, quietly owned the properties where bordels operated. Rent was income, and piety had its price. Documents from Avignon, a city once home to the papacy, show records of licensed houses operating under ecclesiastical oversight. The irony did not go unnoticed by chroniclers. In one account, a satirist wrote that even the angels must turn their gaze away when men who prayed by day crossed the bridge by night. But faith, like law, was adaptable. As theologians wrestled with sin and salvation, the church found a strange ally in its own contradiction. The bordel became not only a physical place but a moral symbol, a reminder of the fragility of human will. To speak of such houses was to speak of temptation itself, made visible in brick and candlelight. For the women who lived within those walls, religion was both comfort and condemnation. Some kept icons beside their beds, praying before every night's work. Others gave offerings to local churches, hoping for mercy in a world that offered little. Confessors often granted lighter penance if a woman promised to leave her trade, though few could afford to keep such vows. Survival, after all, was not a sin that could be absolved in a single confession. The paradox deepened further during holy festivals. When processions wound through the streets, bells ringing and incense rising, the women of the bordel were often instructed to stay indoors, unseen, unheard. Yet city officials, mindful of the economy, still demanded their taxes. So even in silence, they contributed to the faith that condemned them. It was a shadow market of morality, one sustained by the very structures that sought to erase it. In cathedral towns, bishops issued edicts against promiscuity while quietly maintaining revenue from the properties where such acts occurred. In Venice, clerical accounts reveal payments collected from houses of recreation, delicately described but clearly understood. The church's reach was vast, but its purity, like all things human, was imperfect. Still, not every cleric turned a blind eye. Some spoke passionately of reform, envisioning a world where women trapped in vice could find redemption through charity. Convents opened their doors to the repentant, offering shelter in exchange for labor and devotion. Yet even here, escape was rare. For every woman who found a new life behind monastery walls, many more remained in the cycle of poverty and survival, unseen, unnamed, but endlessly present. This duality defined the age. Faith and desire, confession and secrecy, holiness and hunger, all coexisted within the same stone walls, the same narrow streets. The church condemned what the city managed, and the city profited from what the church forgave. It was not hypocrisy alone, but the complexity of a world that understood its own contradictions too well to erase them. And so, when the bells rang at midnight, when prayers gave way to whispers, the same city that raised cathedrals to heaven also kept its lamps burning low by the riverside, where sin and sanctity shared the same air. The lives within. Stories behind the lantern light, beyond the ordinances and sermons, beyond the ledgers and the laws, there were people. And like all great histories, the story of the Bordel is, at its core, the story of human survival. The women who lived and worked within those narrow rooms were not merely the subjects of judgment or regulation. They were daughters, widows, refugees of famine and war. Some had once been servants dismissed without wages, others travelers caught in foreign cities with no family to call upon. In the medieval world, where inheritance followed bloodlines and property defined worth, the margins were crowded with those who had neither. In Paris, records describe women referred to simply as femmes de joie, women of joy. It was a term that carried both irony and empathy. For many, joy was not the reality of their days, but a performance expected by those who paid for company. Yet in that performance, there existed an unspoken resilience. They created small communities inside those walls, cooking together, sharing clothing, protecting one another from the dangers that lingered beyond their doors. Some brothels employed guards to keep order, others depended on the authority of the maîtresse, the housekeeper or matron who ruled with both firmness and care. The women kept routines as structured as any monastery. Candles were lit at dusk, visitors admitted by hour, curfews enforced at dawn. Coins changed hands quietly, while the sound of distant bells marked the passing of another night. For those within, time moved differently, measured not in prayers or feasts, but in faces, footsteps, and the rhythm of necessity. From the few surviving testimonies, a picture emerges of remarkable endurance. In Avignon, one woman named Beatrice petitioned the city for release from her debt to a bordel keeper. Her words, preserved in the archives, speak of exhaustion but also dignity. She did not ask for pity, only for freedom to choose her own life again. Her petition was granted, a rare victory, one small moment of agency in a world that seldom allowed it. Others were less fortunate. Disease was a constant threat, spreading quickly through close quarters. The same officials who taxed the houses also demanded medical inspections, though often too late. Many women died young, their names never recorded beyond a ledger or a fine. Yet even in that anonymity, they left traces, a signature, a mark, a story half told. And within those fleeting lives lay glimpses of humanity that history often forgets. There were friendships, rivalries, songs shared at the end of long nights. There were jokes whispered between work and curfew, laughter carried through thin walls. There were tears, too, and prayers, prayers not for forgiveness, but for endurance. Some men who frequented these houses left accounts that reveal more about themselves than the women they described. Knights and scholars, merchants and priests, they wrote of their encounters in coded language, veiled behind allegory. To them, the bordel was not just a place of indulgence but of confession, a space where the masks of society could briefly fall away. In one such text, a poet from Florence described a house where candles burn low, and each soul speaks honestly, if only for a moment. It is a line that carries something timeless. The understanding that even in the most condemned of places, truth could still flicker like candlelight against the dark. And so, beneath the moral judgments and city statutes, the lives within those walls remind us of something profoundly human. The need to belong, to be seen, to survive. The bordel, for all its shadows, was a shelter, not from sin, but from the harsher cruelties of the outside world. From tolerance to purity. The fall of the medieval bordel. As Europe stepped into the dawn of the 15th and 16th centuries, something began to shift. The same cities that had once tolerated the bordel, even depended on it, grew restless with the weight of their own contradictions. New voices were rising, loud and uncompromising, demanding purity where once there had been pragmatism. The Reformation, and the moral revolutions that surrounded it, would change not just faith but the very way intimacy itself was understood. Where medieval law had regulated desire, the modern conscience sought to repress it. Where city officials had once issued licenses to brothel keepers, reformers now issued condemnations. The tone of the age darkened, not because people had changed, but because they had begun to see themselves differently. The 16th century brought with it new eyes on the world, sharper, judgmental, obsessed with visibility. Luther thundered against houses of vice, while Calvin's Geneva made their destruction a symbol of moral reform. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of monasteries, once partial landlords of brothel districts, left their former tenants adrift. Some women vanished into the streets. Others followed the armies, traveling from town to town, always one step ahead of the new morality. It was, in many ways, a quiet revolution, not fought with swords, but with sermons. The language of sin became harder, the tone colder. The old argument, that controlled vice preserved virtue, began to crumble. In its place came a vision of society that sought to purify rather than manage, to erase rather than understand. And so, across the cities of Europe, one by one, the bordels began to close. Not all at once, but steadily, sometimes burned, sometimes shuttered, sometimes merely renamed. In London, the stews of Southwark, long tolerated and even licensed under royal decree, were officially closed by order of Henry VIII in 1546. The same king whose court thrived on rumor and indulgence now declared moral order a royal duty. But the closing of doors did not end the human need that had kept them open for centuries. It merely pushed it elsewhere, into alleys, taverns, private rooms, and secrecy. Desire, denied its structure, dissolved into the shadows of the city. And in that shift, something was lost, not innocence, but understanding. The medieval world, for all its paradoxes, had accepted imperfection as part of human nature. The new world sought to cleanse it, to draw sharper lines between purity and sin, between acceptable and forbidden. But in doing so, it created a silence where there had once been conversation, a silence that would last for generations. The women who had once lived within the bordel now found themselves without protection or place. Some were imprisoned under new moral laws. Others were sent to reform houses or workhouses, where labor replaced autonomy. A system that had once been flawed but regulated was replaced by one that was cruel in its idealism. And yet, in the margins of these reforms, traces of the old world endured. In Venice, private courtesans still moved through salons and music halls, their art and wit transforming survival into performance. In Paris, secret houses continued under the guise of tea rooms and guest chambers. Even in Geneva, where reformers proclaimed the city pure, the night still carried quiet footsteps and muffled laughter behind closed shutters. No law could erase the human longing that had built the bordels in the first place. It could only drive it deeper underground, out of sight, but never out of existence. By the 17th century, Europe had changed its face. The old brothel districts were gone, replaced by markets, workshops, and schools. The riverbanks where lanterns once swayed in the wind now echoed with the sound of sermons and soldiers. But beneath the cobblestones, beneath the history written in marble and parchment, the memory of those places remained, faint but persistent, like the scent of wax long after the candle has burned out. The story of the Bordel was, in the end, not just a story of desire, but of transformation. It revealed how a society wrestled with its own humanity, how it balanced faith with flesh, order with emotion, judgment with compassion. And though the buildings crumbled, the lesson endured, that no amount of purity can quiet what makes us human. For even as the lanterns dimmed and the doors were sealed, the whispers of that world, of its laughter, its pain, its resilience, still drifted through the centuries, carried softly on the breath of history. History, though written in ink and stone, never truly ends. Even as the medieval Bordels faded into memory, their presence lingered, not in buildings or records alone, but in the way societies continued to think about desire, morality, and control. By the 18th century, Europe had become a different place. Enlightenment thinkers debated reason and liberty, yet even their visions of progress carried old anxieties. The body, once viewed through the lens of sin and salvation, became a subject of medicine, politics, and economy. What had once been a moral issue became a social one. In the great cities, Paris, London, Amsterdam, a new kind of establishment emerged. They were no longer called bordels, though they served a similar purpose. They were houses of pleasure, salons, tea rooms, or social clubs. Their patrons were the poets, diplomats, and philosophers who would shape the coming modern world. And yet, despite the sophistication of their surroundings, the echoes of the medieval past persisted. The courtesans of the Enlightenment inherited more than just the rooms. They inherited the contradictions, the balance between respectability and shame, between influence and dependence. Some became icons of their age. In Paris, women like Ninon de L'Enclos and Madame de Pompadour rose from the margins to shape culture and conversation at the highest levels. They entertained philosophers, advised kings, and defined fashion. But even they lived within boundaries drawn centuries earlier, the same unspoken rule that the woman who offered affection, no matter how intelligent or powerful, could never be truly free from judgment. The legacy of the Bordel had evolved from physical walls to invisible ones. And though the lanterns were gone, the architecture of desire, its economics, its hypocrisies, its quiet humanity, remained. Writers of the time began to treat these spaces with fascination. To some, they were dens of corruption, to others, mirrors of the human soul. In the novels of the 19th century, from Balzac to Zola, the brothel became a stage where society's truths were stripped bare. Behind velvet curtains and chandeliers, they found not sin, but reflection, a portrait of a world that could not reconcile what it preached with what it practiced. And through art and literature, the medieval spirit of the Bordel, its melancholy, its beauty, its contradiction, lived on. Painters like Toulouse-Lautrec captured its rhythm and color, not as scandal, but as life itself, fleeting, flawed, and deeply human. The women in his paintings, though weary, were not condemned. They were observed, remembered, and made immortal through his gaze. In this way, history softened. What had once been judged as sin began to be understood as survival. What was once erased found a new form of remembrance. The Bordel became, paradoxically, a symbol not of moral decay but of human persistence, proof that the need for connection, for closeness, for being seen, could never truly be extinguished by law or sermon. Even today, when one walks the narrow streets of old European quarters, the Marais in Paris, the back lanes of Venice, the older alleys of Prague, the past hums faintly beneath the surface. A carved stone here, an old doorway there, a name that survived through centuries of translation. The traces remain, invisible yet tangible, woven into the DNA of the cities themselves. The Bordel was never just a place. It was a reflection of the society that built it, its needs, its fears, its contradictions. And perhaps that is why it endures in imagination, in stories whispered through time. It reminds us that beneath every system of rules, every layer of civilization, lies the same unchanging truth. People are complex, driven by forces that laws can name but never control. The medieval city tried to balance sin and sanctity. The modern world tries to separate them. Yet in both, the struggle is the same, the attempt to make peace with what it means to be human. And so, when we speak of those old streets and their lanterns, of the women who lived within them and the men who sought them, we are not merely recounting history. We are remembering ourselves, our contradictions, our tenderness, our endless search for meaning in one another. The hidden memory. What the Bordel teaches about humanity and power history is not only found in chronicles, laws, and edicts. Sometimes it resides in the spaces people inhabit, in the lives lived quietly beneath notice, and in the echoes of choices made under constraint. The medieval Bordel, with its paradoxes and shadows, offers just such a lesson. It teaches that power is never absolute. Even in cities dominated by kings, bishops, and councils, ordinary people, particularly women, found ways to negotiate, to survive, to assert agency. Within the walls of the Bordel, hierarchies were present but flexible. A woman could command respect within her household, protect her community, and influence the men who visited, if only for the span of a night. Her survival depended on skill, intelligence, and resilience, not wealth or title. Similarly, the Bordel reveals the limits of morality imposed from above. Law, sermon, and doctrine could regulate spaces, punish, or condone, but they could not erase desire. Human need, for connection or intimacy, found ways to persist. Where regulation failed to contain it, the Bordel adapted. Where prohibition sought to eliminate it, it simply moved into shadows. In these narrow rooms and quiet streets, one also sees the complexity of societal compromise. Medieval authorities, balancing revenue and order, allowed what they condemned. The Church, preaching sin and virtue, tolerated what it could not control. Civic and religious systems were interwoven with human realities, creating a tapestry of paradox. Institutions attempting moral perfection within an imperfect human world. The Bordel, in its essence, is a story of adaptation. It reflects how humans respond to constraint, how structures of authority coexist with the ungovernable rhythms of human behavior. It demonstrates that laws do not simply dictate action, they shape negotiation, dialogue, and compromise. The same city that condemned also sheltered, that punished also taxed, that feared also relied. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of empathy, the quiet recognition that those who lived at the margins were neither evil nor simple. They were human. They laughed, they feared, they endured, they strategized, they mourned. They negotiated their survival within the boundaries imposed upon them, often transforming constraint into skill, punishment into opportunity, and marginalization into community. The memory of the Bordel, preserved faintly in archives, literature, and imagination, is a reminder of human resilience. It teaches that history is not merely about kings, wars, or law. It is about the people who navigate these forces, often in silence, often without recognition, and often without choice. In this hidden memory, we can trace patterns that endure. The tension between regulation and freedom, the negotiation between moral authority and human desire, the ingenuity required to survive within restrictive systems. Through the lens of the Bordel, we see society as it truly is. A network of contradictions, compromises, and unseen struggles. It is neither wholly virtuous nor wholly corrupt. It is profoundly human. Even in modern reflection, the legacy remains. Discussions of morality, power, and autonomy continue, echoing the same debates that occurred in candlelit rooms centuries ago. The questions are timeless. How do we balance regulation with empathy? Authority with survival? Law with lived experience? The Bordels story is, therefore, not just a story of medieval streets or shadowed rooms. It is a story of resilience, negotiation, and the complexity of human society. It is a testament to the enduring capacity of people to adapt, endure, and create meaning, even in the spaces where society seeks to confine them. And so, as we look back through history, through candlelight and stone walls, we see that these hidden lives, these quiet acts of endurance, are not merely footnotes. They are central to understanding what it means to be human, to live, to connect, and to persist against circumstance. Urban shadows. How desire shaped the growth of cities. Cities are not only defined by stone walls, marketplaces, or cathedrals. They are shaped by the rhythms of human life, the flow of labor, trade, celebration, and, quietly, desire. The Bordel, though marginalized and often condemned, was an integral part of that rhythm. Its presence, regulated yet persistent, influenced the growth of medieval and early modern urban life in ways both subtle and profound. In Paris, Florence, and Venice, brothel districts were rarely isolated. They were embedded within the circulatory system of the city, near taverns, inns, and markets where travelers, merchants, and pilgrims passed daily. The flow of people brought commerce, news, and culture. It also brought opportunity. The city planners, consciously or unconsciously, allowed this pattern to persist because it was efficient. Desire became a driver of movement, and movement became a driver of urban growth. Economic historians note that taxes levied on licensed houses provided essential revenue for municipalities. These funds paid for city walls, maintained bridges, and supported the very officials who oversaw morality. Thus, the Bordel was not only a site of private negotiation but a component of civic infrastructure, an uncomfortable but undeniable contributor to the urban economy. Beyond taxation, brothels shaped the spatial and social organization of cities. Streets, alleys, and districts were arranged to keep them contained, while still accessible. Their location reflected a careful balance, near enough for business, far enough to minimize disruption to commerce and worship. In Venice, for example, the red light districts were clustered along canals, where movement could be monitored and regulated, a geographical compromise between desire and discretion. The Bordel also influenced social dynamics. Men of all classes frequented them, creating interactions between wealth, status, and opportunity. Knights might meet merchants, students might meet clergy, all within a space where hierarchy was acknowledged but softened. And women, often constrained in the broader society, exercised agency within these walls, negotiating safety, loyalty, and sometimes influence over patrons. Even fleeting encounters carried long-term consequences, debts, favors, and connections that rippled through the economic and social fabric of the city. Literature and records from the period reveal that the Bordel was more than a place of entertainment. It was a hub of information and culture. Patrons shared news from distant lands, exchanged ideas, and even commissioned poetry or songs. In some ways, the Bordel was a miniature crossroads of knowledge, where curiosity and desire intersected. Yet the presence of these districts was never without tension. Moral reformers, religious orders, and civic authorities constantly debated how to reconcile utility with virtue. Proposals ranged from strict closure to regulated oversight, from relocation to surveillance. The Bordel survived because, despite disapproval, it fulfilled multiple needs: economic, social, and psychological. Desire, after all, is not merely personal, it is societal, shaping movement, commerce, and urban culture. By examining the bordel's influence, we see a pattern that extends beyond morality or law. The city itself adapted to human need. Streets, districts, and infrastructure were subtly guided by behaviors deemed inappropriate elsewhere. Desire, once considered marginal, shaped the very core of civic life. And so, as one walks the streets of old European quarters today, one can glimpse the echoes of that history. The curves of an alley, the clustering of buildings, the small bridges over quiet canals, all speak of lives lived, of transactions made, and of humanity navigating constraint. The bordel, though hidden or condemned, left a lasting imprint, not just on memory, but on the physical and social shape of the medieval city itself. Negotiation and survival. The subtle power of women in the bordel. Within the walls of the bordel, life was a constant negotiation. It was not simply a matter of following rules or enduring circumstance. For the women who lived and worked there, survival demanded intelligence, strategy, and adaptability. Their power was subtle, often invisible to the city officials and moral authorities who sought to control them, yet it shaped the very environment they inhabited. The maîtresse, or matron of the house, held a unique position. She balanced authority and empathy, enforcing rules while protecting her employees. Some were widows who had inherited the house from a husband, others had risen from the ranks of workers themselves. Their role required diplomacy, negotiating with city inspectors, resolving disputes among women, and mediating tensions with patrons. A single misstep could jeopardize safety or income, so vigilance was constant. Women exercised influence within a carefully coded hierarchy. They determined who could stay in the house, when guests could be admitted, and how conflicts were resolved. Their authority extended beyond the walls, into the social network of the city. Letters, gifts, and favors were exchanged, allowing some to build networks that reached even into civic offices or guilds. For many, survival depended on knowledge of the law, the city, and human behavior. Understanding when to comply, when to resist, and when to negotiate was as important as any coin earned. Some women documented debts, gifts, or promises, leaving behind faint traces in municipal archives. These fragments reveal an extraordinary capacity for memory, foresight, and calculation. Yet life was not only negotiation, it was also resilience in the face of vulnerability. Illness, injury, and social stigma were constant threats. Disease spread quickly through crowded quarters, and medical assistance was often limited. Women relied on each other for care, sharing remedies, comfort, and advice. The sense of community within the bordel, though rarely recorded in formal histories, was essential to survival. Personal relationships also became tools of influence. Friendships, alliances, and mentorships allowed women to navigate power structures both inside and outside the house. In some cases, women leveraged these connections to secure safety or advantage, negotiating protection from authorities or mediating disputes with patrons. The capacity to act within constraint was a form of quiet power, a lesson often invisible to those who judged them from afar. Letters, diaries, and court records hint at a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Some women anticipated the actions of patrons or city officials, adjusting their routines or strategies accordingly. They understood the economy of favor and obligation, often wielding influence in ways that did not require wealth or formal status. Even the act of daily labor was itself a negotiation. Choices about timing, presentation, and interaction were guided by experience and instinct. Small decisions, how to greet a visitor, how to manage a dispute, when to request protection, were matters of life and livelihood. The women of the bordel survived not by passivity, but by constant calculation and awareness. Ultimately, their subtle power lay in their ability to adapt. They operated within a world that sought to limit their freedom, yet they carved spaces of autonomy, influence, and resilience. Though history often records them anonymously, their impact was tangible, in the functioning of the bordel, in the economy of the city, and in the social structures that shaped medieval life. In this quiet, persistent influence, we see the bordel not merely as a place of moral concern, but as a microcosm of human ingenuity. It demonstrates how individuals, constrained by law and custom, find ways to navigate, survive, and even shape the societies in which they live. Economics and exchange. The bordel as a social institution. The bordel, though often judged solely through moral lenses, functioned as more than a collection of rooms and lanterns. It was an economic institution, a complex node within the broader network of medieval and early modern urban life. Its influence extended beyond individual survival, shaping commerce, labor, and social hierarchies. Every transaction within its walls carried significance. Payments were not only for company or warmth, they were part of a system of exchange that sustained the city itself. Taxes collected from licensed houses flowed into municipal coffers, funding public works, fortifications, and civic administration. In this sense, the bordel became an unwitting contributor to urban stability. The women who worked there were participants in an economy that demanded skill, timing, and discretion. They managed debts, negotiated fees, and sometimes extended credit to patrons. Their labor was recognized by law, yet paradoxically marginalized by society. While earning a living, they also navigated social hierarchies, determining how to distribute resources and influence within the house. Brothel keepers, for their part, acted as managers, accountants, and intermediaries. They maintained records, oversaw security, and liaised with city officials. In some cases, these women also acted as mentors, teaching newcomers not only survival skills but also the economic literacy necessary to thrive within the system. The bordel also affected the urban labor market more broadly. By concentrating wealth and attention in specific districts, it created ancillary economic activity, from laundries and bakeries to taverns and markets. Merchants and craftsmen, even indirectly, relied on the flows of coin generated by these districts. In this way, the bordel's existence shaped patterns of consumption, labor, and urban development. Yet economic exchange was not the only currency at play. Social capital, knowledge, and influence were equally valuable. Women who understood the habits and preferences of patrons could convert attention into favors, protection, or even legal advocacy. Patrons, too, gained status through access, a quiet assertion of power that extended beyond the room into social circles and civic structures. Regulation, while moral in rhetoric, often functioned as an economic tool. Licensing, inspection, and taxation allowed cities to monitor the flow of money and influence. The law did not simply aim to suppress desire. It sought to harness it, integrating human behavior into the framework of civic governance. The bordel thus exemplifies a broader principle, that even spaces condemned for moral reasons can operate as crucial components of societal organization. Historical records show that during festivals or market days, activity in these districts surged. Travelers brought wealth and news. Locals brought curiosity and coin. The bordel's economic rhythm mirrored that of the city itself, adapting to seasonal, social, and political fluctuations. Even closures and reforms could not entirely eliminate its function. The demand persisted, and the city found ways to accommodate it, legally or clandestinely. Ultimately, the bordel was a microcosm of society's contradictions. Economic necessity versus moral condemnation, legal recognition versus social marginalization, survival and agency within constrained circumstances. Its presence demonstrates how human behavior, desire, and social structure intersect. The bordel was not merely a moral dilemma, it was a dynamic institution, an engine of exchange, influence, and adaptation. And as we consider its place in history, we recognize a lesson that endures. Societal systems are rarely cleanly divided into virtue and vice. Instead, they are networks of negotiation, compromise, and survival, shaped as much by the margins as by the centers of power. The shadows of reputation, rumor, scandal, and influence. The bordel existed not only in law, economics, and personal lives, but also in the imagination of the city. Its presence shaped reputation, fueled rumor, and colored the perception of both women and men who interacted with it. The whisper of activity behind closed doors was as influential as any law or ordinance, carrying consequences that rippled through social networks. In medieval cities, gossip was currency. Stories about patrons, disputes, or escapes traveled quickly, shaping alliances and power dynamics. A well-placed rumor could protect a woman from harassment or expose her to danger. Patrons, too, had reputations at stake. To be known as frequenting such establishments could harm a knight's honor, a merchant's credibility, or a priest's authority. Scandal often operated as a form of social regulation. A rumor of impropriety could bring the scrutiny of city officials, the judgment of peers, or the sanction of the church. Yet, paradoxically, it also reinforced the bordel's power. Attention, whether approving or condemning, confirmed the significance of these districts. To be observed, even negatively, affirmed their central role in the urban ecosystem. Literary accounts of the period often emphasize this tension. Chronicles, pamphlets, and diaries reveal a fascination with scandal that was as much moral instruction as entertainment. The bordel became a mirror for society, reflecting both its desires and its anxieties. Its visibility made it a locus for storytelling, a repository of cautionary tales and moral reflection. Women navigated this landscape carefully. Reputation could be managed through discretion, alliances, or negotiation. Some cultivated networks of patronage that insulated them from exposure. Others relied on secrecy and timing to maintain relative safety. A woman's ability to survive was as dependent on understanding social currents as it was on managing day-to-day interactions. At the same time, the bordel served as a site of influence. Patrons often carried information from distant towns or courts, and women who understood this network could leverage it subtly. Letters, gifts, and favors flowed along unseen channels, transforming private knowledge into social currency. In some cases, the bordel became a hub for political insight or cultural trends, a hidden marketplace not of goods, but of information. Scandal, rumor, and reputation intertwined with law and faith to create a delicate balance. The city tolerated the bordel because it could regulate it, but regulation was only effective when perception was managed. Too much visibility invited reform or closure, too little visibility risked disorder. Social judgment and official oversight were inseparable in maintaining the delicate ecosystem. And yet, despite scrutiny, the bordel persisted. It survived not only through law and negotiation, but through the human capacity to adapt to perception itself. It thrived in whispers and shadows, shaping and being shaped by the very society that condemned it. Through these dynamics, the bordel emerges as more than a physical space. It was a stage for human interaction, an arena of subtle power, and a reflection of society's complex moral economy. Rumor, scandal, and reputation were not mere distractions. They were instruments of social order, entwined with survival and influence. In the flicker of candlelight, Behind the doors that bore both secrecy and law, we see a society negotiating its own contradictions, where desire, judgment, and survival intersected in patterns both visible and hidden. The transition to modernity, desire, regulation, and memory. As Europe approached the 17th and 18th centuries, the social, economic, and moral landscapes began to shift. Cities grew larger, trade expanded, and political structures became more centralized. Within this transformation, the bordel, once an accepted, if regulated, institution, began to face new pressures, both visible and subtle. Modernizing authorities, influenced by religious reform, Enlightenment thinking, and urban planning, increasingly sought to redefine acceptable behavior. Desire, once acknowledged as a force to be managed, was now to be restrained and, ideally, confined. Licenses that had regulated brothels were revoked in many regions. Ordinances demanded closures, relocations, or stricter oversight. The reasons were complex. Moral reformers argued for public virtue, while officials cited health and order. The rise of policing and bureaucratic oversight introduced mechanisms to monitor behavior more efficiently than ever before. Disease control, taxation, and population management became intertwined with moral campaigns, placing the bordel under pressure from multiple fronts. Yet human need proved resilient. Even as official districts closed, informal networks emerged. Hidden rooms, private gatherings, and clandestine establishments ensured that demand persisted. What had once been a publicized, regulated space shifted underground, invisible but enduring. The women of the bordel adapted once more. Some moved into semi-legal households, others became courtesans serving influential patrons. Survival required strategy, knowledge of the law, connections within civic structures, and an understanding of social perception. Their resilience allowed them to continue negotiating influence, safety, and autonomy despite increasingly hostile conditions. In literature, the bordel became both cautionary tale and source of fascination. Novels, pamphlets, and memoirs depicted these spaces as sites of corruption, intrigue, or even sophistication, reflecting society's conflicted attitudes toward desire and morality. Balzac and Zola, centuries later, explored these dynamics in vivid narrative, portraying the bordel as an engine of social interaction, economic exchange, and human complexity. Memory, too, became a form of regulation. As cities modernized, the bordel was gradually erased from official histories, recorded only in archives, gossip, and literary imagination. Its absence from the streets was total, but its presence in consciousness remained, a faint echo of a world that had once openly recognized the intersection of human need and social order. Modern historians now examine these spaces not for scandal, but for understanding. The bordel becomes a lens through which to explore questions of gender, power, economics, and morality. It reveals the limits of authority, the resilience of those marginalized, and the persistent tension between societal ideals and human reality. The transition to modernity was not a simple closure, but a transformation. Desire did not disappear, it shifted in form, moving into homes, salons, theaters, and ultimately into culture itself. The bordel, in memory and influence, shaped not only urban development but social imagination, leaving traces in literature, law, and moral discourse. And so, while the lanterns of the medieval bordel no longer glow in the streets, their shadow lingers. They remind us that the structures societies build, both moral and legal, are only partially capable of shaping human behavior. The rest is left to adaptation, negotiation, and memory. Intimacy, power, and the lessons of history. The story of the bordel is not merely a tale of architecture, law, or even morality. It is a story of human complexity, of how intimacy and power intersect, of how survival is negotiated within constraints, and of how societies attempt, often imperfectly, to regulate the ungovernable. Medieval and early modern Europe treated desire as a force to be controlled, but in doing so, it revealed the limits of authority. Laws, ordinances, and moral edicts could regulate behavior, but they could not erase need. Desire persisted, flowing through shadows, streets, and hidden rooms, shaping economic exchange, urban development, and social networks along the way. The women of the Bordel exemplify resilience within constraint. Their lives were measured not by wealth or status, but by skill, foresight, and adaptability. Through negotiation, discretion, and subtle influence, they transformed marginalization into survival and agency. Their strategies illuminate the quiet power of those often overlooked in formal histories, the capacity to navigate complex systems and maintain dignity in a world structured against them. Power itself emerges as a nuanced force in these stories. Patrons wielded economic influence, authorities wielded moral and legal authority, the church wielded spiritual oversight. Yet the women of the Bordel exercised their own form of power, one that was relational, subtle, and often invisible to those outside the walls. Influence, it seems, is not always overt. It can be exercised through knowledge, strategy, and the ability to navigate constraint. This interplay of intimacy and power extends beyond the Bordel itself. It offers insight into human behavior across history, how societies attempt to control what is deemed dangerous or improper, and how individuals adapt within those systems. It reminds us that survival often requires more than compliance. It requires understanding, ingenuity, and the ability to negotiate both seen and unseen forces. History also teaches empathy. The Bordel challenges us to look past judgment and recognize the humanity of those living in constrained circumstances. These women were not merely victims of circumstance. They were active participants in shaping their own lives, however limited their options. Their stories demand acknowledgement, not only as historical curiosity, but as a lens for understanding the resilience of the human spirit. Finally, the Bordel leaves an enduring mark on imagination and memory. Its traces persist in literature, urban design, and cultural discourse. Though erased from streets and city maps, its influence remains, in the rhythms of urban life, in stories of survival, and in the recognition of human complexity that no law, sermon, or ordinance could fully contain. The lesson is clear. Societies may seek order, and laws may attempt to regulate, but human behavior, desire, resilience, ingenuity, will always find a way to persist. History, when examined through spaces like the Bordel, becomes less about moral absolutes and more about the subtleties of survival, power, and human connection. In the quiet echoes of medieval streets, behind doors long closed, we find a mirror of ourselves, negotiating limits, navigating constraint, and striving to endure. The Bordel, in all its contradictions, is a reminder that humanity is never simple, never fully governed, and never without resilience. The enduring shadows. How the medieval Bordel influences modern culture. Though the medieval Bordels themselves have long vanished from city streets, their influence persists, not in bricks and mortar, but in imagination, literature, and cultural memory. The echoes of these spaces inform how societies perceive desire, morality, and agency, even centuries after the lanterns have gone out. In literature, the Bordel lives on as both symbol and narrative device. Writers from the 18th century to the modern day have drawn upon its paradoxes, its mixture of constraint and freedom, judgment and survival, to explore human complexity. Courtesans, workers, and patrons alike appear as characters whose lives illuminate the subtle interactions of power, resilience, and social expectation. In theater and art, these spaces provide both inspiration and caution. Paintings, prints, and stage performances depict the bordel as a microcosm of society, a setting where ambition, desire, and vulnerability intersect. The focus is often not scandal alone, but human behavior in tension, relationships formed, decisions weighed, and survival negotiated in quiet, intimate spaces. Even urban design carries traces of this legacy. The clustering of streets, the separation of districts, the ebb and flow of public and private spaces in modern cities often mirror patterns established centuries earlier. Desire and commerce, regulation and discretion, have always shaped the physical layout of urban life. The bordel, once a visible part of the city, contributed to these rhythms, leaving subtle traces in the way cities evolved. Modern discourse also grapples with the same contradictions that medieval authorities faced. Questions of morality, legality, and human agency continue to resonate. Discussions around labor, autonomy, and regulation echo the negotiations of the past. The bordel reminds us that policies, whether moral or economic, are only partially effective if they ignore human needs and behaviors. Even popular imagination reflects this legacy. Films, novels, and documentaries often romanticize or moralize, yet they consistently return to the bordel as a symbol of survival, negotiation, and the persistence of human desire. Its story serves as both a lens and a mirror, showing society's ongoing tension between control and freedom, virtue and indulgence. Ultimately, the medieval bordel is more than a historical curiosity. It is a testament to resilience, adaptability, and the enduring complexity of human life. Its memory teaches that even in constrained circumstances, individuals find ways to assert agency, cultivate influence, and navigate social structures. It teaches empathy, showing that survival often requires subtle power and quiet ingenuity. Through the centuries, the bordel has become a cultural touchstone, a reminder that human desire, social negotiation, and resilience cannot be erased, only transformed. Its shadows linger in streets, stories, and imaginations, connecting past and present in subtle, persistent ways. As we reflect on these spaces, we see not only their historical context but their broader lesson. Humanity is defined by complexity, persistence, and the capacity to navigate constraint. The bordel, in all its contradictions, serves as a quiet but enduring guide to understanding the interplay of power, survival, and society itself. Moral paradox and human nature. Reflections on the bordel. The medieval bordel, when examined closely, reveals a profound moral paradox. It existed in a world that sought to separate virtue from vice, yet thrived precisely because that separation was impossible. Desire, survival, and social order were intertwined in ways that defied simple judgment, challenging the very notion that human behavior could be fully categorized as right or wrong. This paradox offers insight into human nature itself. People act not only according to law or morality, but according to necessity, opportunity, and circumstance. The women who navigated the bordel, the patrons who visited it, and the authorities who regulated it all participated in a system that required compromise. Each acted within constraints, yet each shaped the world in subtle ways. Authority, whether civic or religious, demonstrated both power and limitation. Kings, bishops, and city councils could legislate, punish, and license, yet they could not fully control behavior. Human ingenuity, need, and resilience consistently found ways to circumvent or adapt to imposed structures. The bordel becomes a case study in the limits of control. Morality cannot be imposed without negotiation, and regulation cannot eliminate desire. For those who lived within its walls, the bordel offered lessons in agency. Even in constrained circumstances, the women exercised skill, judgment, and strategy. They cultivated networks, managed risk, and leveraged social knowledge to maintain autonomy. Their lives remind us that power does not always manifest as dominance. It often resides in subtle influence, quiet negotiation, and the ability to adapt. At the same time, the Bordel highlights the fragility of reputation and perception. Rumor and scandal acted as informal regulators, shaping behavior and reinforcing social norms. Authority, morality, and influence were intertwined with the perceptions of others, revealing the profound impact of social observation on human conduct. Survival, therefore, was as much about perception and negotiation as it was about physical or economic security. In the broader arc of history, the Bordel teaches resilience and complexity. It demonstrates that human systems, economic, legal, moral, are inherently imperfect, and that those living at the margins often navigate these imperfections with ingenuity. It underscores the interplay between societal structure and individual agency, showing that constraint often inspires adaptation rather than submission. Finally, the Bordel serves as a mirror for contemporary reflection. Modern societies continue to grapple with similar contradictions. The tension between regulation and freedom, morality and survival, law and desire. The lessons of the Bordel are timeless. Human behavior is complex, morality is nuanced, and resilience often exists where it is least expected. In this way, the medieval Bordel is more than a historical curiosity. It is a reflection on humanity, a reminder that complexity, compromise, and adaptability are constants across time. The shadows of its lanterns, the whispers of its rooms, and the echoes of its stories endure not as scandal, but as insight into power, survival, and the enduring nature of human desire. The Bordel in memory, archives, literature, and historical interpretation. Though the physical Bordels of medieval and early modern Europe have long vanished, their presence endures through records, literature, and historical interpretation. In municipal archives, tax rolls, licenses, and court records provide glimpses into their operations. Each entry, often terse and transactional, speaks to the intersection of law, economy, and human behavior. Names appear fleetingly: women, patrons, officials, leaving traces of lives negotiated within constraint. Historians have painstakingly reconstructed these fragments, reading between the lines of fiscal ledgers and legal documents to understand patterns of survival, regulation, and influence. The Bordel becomes more than a subject of moral curiosity. It becomes a lens through which to explore the social, economic, and gendered dynamics of past societies. These records reveal not only what was forbidden or tolerated, but also how people navigated complexity. Literature and creative works play a complementary role. Chronicles, novels, and poems often dramatize life within these spaces, capturing social nuances, cultural perceptions, and the rhythms of daily survival. From medieval satirical accounts to the novels of Balzac and Zola, the Bordel emerges as a site of human negotiation, an arena where morality, desire, and power intersect. The interpretive lens of history is shaped by the biases and intentions of its observers. Clerics, reformers, and chroniclers often cast the Bordel in terms of sin or social danger, while municipal records emphasize taxation and oversight. Modern historians, however, approach the subject with greater empathy and nuance, highlighting resilience, agency, and the subtleties of social negotiation. Art, too, preserves memory. Paintings, prints, and sketches depict interiors, patrons, and courtesans, offering visual evidence of social life and spatial arrangement. These images, when combined with textual records, allow a more complete understanding of the Bordel's role, not as a place of simple vice, but as a complex institution intertwined with urban life. The study of the Bordel also illuminates the evolution of social norms. By tracing its regulation, closure, and adaptation, historians see the gradual shift from tolerance to repression, from pragmatic oversight to moral reform. This trajectory offers insight into broader societal transformations, the centralization of authority, the development of urban governance, and changing attitudes toward gender and sexuality. Through archives, literature, and artistic representation, the Bordel persists as both a historical and cultural touchstone. It reminds us that even spaces marginalized or condemned by society have significance, revealing patterns of human behavior, survival strategies, and the constant interplay between regulation and desire. In studying these traces, we learn not only about the past, but about enduring human dynamics, negotiation under constraint, the subtle forms of influence exercised by the marginalized, and the ways society both observes and shapes behavior. The Bordel, though long absent from city streets, remains present in memory, a testament to the resilience, complexity, and ingenuity of those who lived within its walls. The Bordel as mirror. Lessons for modern society and human behavior. The Bordel, in its medieval and early modern forms, serves as more than a historical curiosity. It functions as a mirror, reflecting enduring aspects of human behavior and society. Its story invites reflection on the interplay of desire, power, and social constraint, and the ways individuals navigate systems that simultaneously enable and restrict them. One lesson is the persistence of human need. Societies can legislate, moralize, and regulate, yet desire and survival often find pathways beyond direct control. The Bordel existed because human behavior could not be fully contained, a paradox that continues to resonate in modern social structures. Another lesson lies in resilience and agency. The women of the Bordel negotiated the constraints imposed upon them with skill, foresight, and adaptability. Their influence, though often subtle, shaped both the economic and social dynamics of their communities. In this, they remind us that power is not always visible or formal. It can exist quietly, exercised through knowledge, relationships, and strategic action. The Bordel also illustrates the complexity of morality and social perception. Rumor, scandal, and reputation were as influential as law, demonstrating that human systems are maintained not solely through legislation but through social negotiation. The interplay of judgment and survival, visibility and discretion, shaped behavior and determined outcomes. Modern society continues to grapple with similar dynamics. Regulations, norms, and moral frameworks attempt to influence behavior, yet human agency, adaptation, and creativity often find ways to persist. The Bordel teaches that understanding human behavior requires more than rules. It requires empathy, observation, and recognition of context. Furthermore, the economic dimension of the Bordel offers insight into the intersection of labor, commerce, and regulation. The houses were not only spaces of intimacy, but nodes in urban economies, contributing revenue, employment, and the circulation of social influence. This demonstrates how marginal or morally contested spaces can play critical roles in societal infrastructure. Finally, the Bordel endures in memory, literature, and cultural imagination. Its stories, preserved in archives, art, and narrative, remind us that history is not only about rulers or law but about those who lived, negotiated, and survived in the shadows. It underscores the importance of preserving human experience in all its complexity. In contemplating the Bordel, we confront broader truths. Systems of control are limited by human behavior. Agency exists even within constraint. Morality and survival often exist in tension, not harmony. Social perception can be as powerful as legal authority. The medieval Bordel, once condemned and regulated, now teaches timeless lessons about human nature, society, and resilience. Its lanterns may have faded, its doors closed, yet the patterns of negotiation, survival, and subtle influence persist, echoing across centuries, inviting reflection on both past and present. Through its story, we are reminded that history is not merely a record of events, but a mirror in which we may recognize the enduring complexities of humanity. The Bordel and gendered power. Understanding social hierarchies and influence. The medieval Bordel offers a window into the intricate interplay of gender and power. Within its walls, the usual hierarchies of society were reshaped, constrained, and negotiated in ways both subtle and profound. The space functioned as a microcosm where conventional authority over women, labor, and social interaction was simultaneously enforced and subverted. Women, who were often marginalized in broader society, exercised agency within the Bordel. Their survival depended on understanding relationships, predicting behavior, and strategically navigating both patrons and authorities. Power here was relational. Influence was earned not through formal rank or wealth alone, but through knowledge, skill, and the management of perception. The matron or maîtresse exemplified this dynamic. She wielded authority over the household, regulated behavior, and ensured compliance with civic and moral expectations. Yet her authority was contingent, dependent on the cooperation of the women under her care, the compliance of patrons, and the oversight of city officials. Her position illustrates a nuanced form of gendered power, constrained yet meaningful, informal yet impactful. Patrons, too, were caught within these hierarchies. Social rank provided access and influence, but their behavior was moderated by the strategies of women within the Bordel. Negotiation, discretion, and mutual understanding shaped interactions, demonstrating that influence was rarely unilateral. This gendered dynamic extended beyond the immediate walls. Women cultivated networks of information, protection, and social leverage that reached into broader civic and commercial structures. Letters, favors, and alliances transformed private influence into public consequence, subtly reshaping urban life and economic flow. The Bordel also reveals the societal tensions surrounding female labor and autonomy. Women's work was essential to the functioning of the establishment, yet it was simultaneously marginalized and stigmatized. Survival demanded intelligence, resilience, and adaptability, qualities often unrecognized or undervalued by the wider society. In this, the Bordel exposes the paradox of power. Those most constrained socially often develop the most sophisticated forms of agency. Understanding these gender dynamics offers insight into broader social structures. It demonstrates how constraints imposed by law, morality, or custom are navigated creatively, and how social influence can manifest in forms other than wealth or official authority. The Bordel, in its paradoxes, serves as a case study in the negotiation of gendered power, how individuals exercise agency under constraint, shape social networks, and influence both personal and civic life. Through its history, we learn that power is not monolithic. It is relational, contingent, and often invisible. The women of the Bordel remind us that survival and influence are not always expressed through dominance, but through strategy, foresight, and understanding of human behavior. Ultimately, the Bordel teaches that gendered power is complex, adaptive, and enduring. It illuminates the subtle ways marginalized actors navigate social hierarchies, challenge authority, and shape the world around them. Lessons that continue to resonate in modern analyses of society, labor, and human interaction. Urban culture, desire, and social negotiation. The Bordel is a lens on city life. The Bordel, though often confined to a few streets or districts, had a profound impact on the rhythm and structure of medieval urban life. It shaped not only commerce and economy, but also patterns of social interaction, movement, and cultural exchange. By observing its presence, we gain insight into the broader mechanisms through which desire, regulation, and survival intersected in the city. City planners and civic authorities were acutely aware of these dynamics. Streets, alleys, and canals were organized to contain, monitor, and regulate bordels, balancing accessibility with discretion. Location was strategic. close enough to markets and inns to attract patrons, yet segregated enough to prevent disruption of civic and religious life. These spatial arrangements reveal the ways in which urban infrastructure was influenced by human behavior, a testament to the subtle power of desire in shaping physical space. The economic influence of the bordel extended beyond taxation. Patrons traveling through cities carried not only coin but information, news, and cultural ideas. Taverns, markets, and transport hubs benefited from this circulation of people and money, creating a ripple effect that intertwined the bordel with broader urban networks. Even those outside its walls, merchants, laborers, and artisans, experienced its indirect impact, highlighting the integration of marginal spaces into the life of the city. Social negotiation was central to urban life around the bordel. Women managed interactions with patrons, authorities, and each other, exercising subtle power in contexts that might otherwise appear constrained. Patrons navigated social expectations, reputation, and legal oversight, while authorities monitored compliance and maintained order. The bordel became a microcosm of city life, a space where rules, negotiation, and human behavior intersected in observable and sometimes transformative ways. Culturally, the bordel influenced storytelling, performance, and artistic expression. Songs, poems, and plays often drew upon its rhythms and narratives, capturing both the intimacy and the negotiation inherent to these spaces. Artistic depictions highlighted the interplay of appearance and perception, power and vulnerability, emphasizing the bordel as a site of human complexity rather than simple morality. Moreover, the bordel offers insight into urban resilience. Cities are not static, they respond to demand, opportunity, and constraint. The persistence of these districts, despite regulation and moral scrutiny, demonstrates how urban systems adapt to the realities of human need. Desire, like commerce, shapes the flow of the city, creating invisible currents that inform both structure and social order. Through this lens, the bordel emerges as more than a place of moral controversy. It serves as a window into the dynamics of urban culture, how economies function, how social hierarchies are navigated, and how human behavior shapes, and is shaped by, the city. The lessons extend beyond history. They illuminate enduring principles of social negotiation, spatial organization, and cultural interplay that continue to influence modern urban life. In the quiet corners of medieval streets, where lanterns flickered and whispers moved unseen, the bordel acted as both catalyst and mirror, shaping commerce, culture, and human interaction in ways that continue to echo in our understanding of cities today. Conclusion and reflection. The bordel is history, memory, and human insight. The story of the medieval bordel, traced across centuries of urban life, law, and human negotiation, offers a profound window into society. It is not merely a tale of morality, vice, or regulation. It is a story of human behavior, resilience, and the enduring complexity of life in constrained circumstances. Throughout history, the bordel functioned simultaneously as a space of survival, negotiation, and subtle influence. Women exercised agency in ways both visible and hidden, shaping economic and social networks, while patrons navigated reputation, desire, and social expectation. Authorities attempted control through law, taxation, and moral regulation, yet their power was inevitably partial, constantly mediated by the realities of human need and ingenuity. The bordel reveals the limits of authority and the enduring presence of human resilience. It demonstrates that power can be relational, influence can be subtle, and survival often requires adaptability, foresight, and understanding of human behavior. These lessons extend beyond history, offering insight into modern society, urban organization, and social negotiation. Culturally, the bordel has left a lasting imprint. Literature, art, and archives preserve traces of its existence, capturing the complexities of daily life, social interaction, and moral tension. The narratives it inspired reflect not just scandal, but intelligence, strategy, and the persistence of human desire. Even in memory, the Bordel challenges simplistic judgments and invites reflection on the nuanced interplay of morality, survival, and societal expectation. Urban life, too, was shaped by these spaces. Streets, districts, and economic flows adapted to the rhythms of the Bordel, integrating desire into the city's structure. The persistence of these districts demonstrates the ways in which human behavior informs spatial and social organization, leaving subtle but enduring patterns in urban development. Ultimately, the Bordel stands as a mirror of human nature. It reflects the tension between authority and adaptation, morality and necessity, constraint and agency. It reminds us that history is not solely written by rulers or institutions, but by those who navigate, survive, and subtly shape the structures around them. In contemplating the Bordel, we are invited to recognize the quiet ingenuity of those who lived at society's margins, to see the interplay of power and negotiation, and to reflect on the persistent patterns of human behavior that transcend time. The lanterns may have dimmed, the doors closed, and the streets changed, yet the lessons remain. History, when examined through spaces like the Bordel, becomes a meditation on human resilience, the negotiation of constraint, and the enduring complexity of society. Through its story, the Bordel teaches timeless truths. That human life is rarely simple, that survival often requires subtle power, and that understanding others, even those marginalized or condemned, is essential to understanding ourselves. And so, as we close this reflection, we are reminded that history is not only a record of events, but a mirror of humanity, flickering with light and shadow, negotiation and survival, morality and desire, all entwined across time.